Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome. We're so excited that you're here. We just first want to just note to everyone that there is a closed captioning at the bottom of the screen, and that you can also access a live transcript, which will then come up on the right side of your screen. Does anyone need, can anyone see that? I need any sort of real, I'm just getting like a little thumbs up. We're all good. Awesome sauce. All right, great. Okay, so I just want to quickly just go over the agenda for today. So today you are in, we're talking about inclusive COVID response. And what we're going to do is first we're going to just sort of start off with just sort of people introduce themselves, introduce our wonderful facilitators. Then we're going to go into an exciting presentation. And then we will have a sort of Q&A afterwards. And then you guys will go into the big breakout groups. So with no delay, let's get right into introducing these awesome facilitators. So first we have Diane Samarasan. She is the founding executive director of the Disability Rights Fund and the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund. In her role, she partners with the board and staff on strategic direction, fosters relationships with key donors and partners, and ensures visibility of DRF and DRAF and grantee work among other foundations, and with development actors and other human rights movements. Diana previously led a legal advocacy organization based in Budapest, which is now called Validity, which litigates the rights of persons with disabilities in institutional settings, managed the Russian and Eastern European programs of Doctors of the World, and was a mental health coordinator for the American Refugee Committee during the Kosovo crisis. She lives in Boston with her daughter, and she was very exciting. She rides a unicycle. And then, I know, isn't that awesome? And then we have Melanie Kawano-Chiu, is the Learning and Evaluation Manager at the Disability Rights Fund and the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund. In her role, Melanie leads principal and human rights-based monitoring, evaluation, and learning across 20 countries currently in DR and DRF's grant-making portfolio. Previous positions include managing a grants program for underreached groups at the American Red Cross and creating a field-wide consortium around the collective change and measuring impact as a director of evaluation at the Alliance for Peace Building. Melanie was born and raised in Hawaii, which is just awesome, but she now lives in a suburb of Los Angeles County with her husband and 7-year-old daughter, who has an auditory hypersensitivity. Her brain processes
20-minute presentation that Mia said, we'll then have plenty of time for discussion afterward. And our goal, I think most of you are coming in with little to no context about our work. So we'll probably spend the first little bit giving you like the tiniest bit of context. There's always more, but we tried to just whittle it down to like the top line. We'll also do like a little bit of top line context about disability rights. Like what is that? And like, what does it look like? And what do we mean when we say disability rights? What's kind of undergirding it? So we'll do like that context setup in the first piece. And then Melanie is really going to go a little bit deeper on like what we've learned during the pandemic, in particular, grounded in our participatory approach. And we'll be looking at the chat while we're talking. We're certainly a small enough group where like I think we can have a really robust discussion afterward. But if there is like a clarifying question or something that you're like, wait, I need to hear more about this right now, or please explain that term, I don't know what it is, we would love for you to like interrupt us, either in the chat or just by unmuting. It's really like not a problem and like preferable to us. So with that, does that sound good to everyone? Any questions up top? No? Can you all see my screen? Yeah. Okay, cool. So I'm just going to kick us off. On our screen, I have a title slide. It's white text on a blue background that just says Disability Rights Fund's Lessons Learned in Inclusive COVID Response, Greater Giving Summit, April 2020. It's not 2020 though, it's 2021. My bad. That's about how this year has been going. So hopefully that's the only typo here. And you'll also see our website, disabilityrightsfund.org, and our Twitter handle, which is disub rights fund, and you can feel free to tweet anything you hear as we go along if that is your thing. Side note, I find captioning really helps me when I tweet because then you can get like a precise quote or something. It's really cool. Accessibility, it's for everyone. Um, so I'm here to talk with you about like who are we? What do we do? So for starters, you might have heard in our intros, we all work for two organizations. We work for the Disability Rights Fund, which is a 501c3, and we work for the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund, which is a 501c4. And so both of these funds are set up as collaborative funds that work to advance disability rights movements around the world, by really like supporting persons with disabilities to advocate for their rights. And so on the screen, you will see an image that's titled Pathway to Change. And this, I'm not going to like read it directly. I'm just going to talk about it. But you can look at it as I go. And what you basically see pictured, there's an image of a lot of people, some with visible disabilities, all different colors, just in silhouette in the middle. And we talk about how we're promoting an intersectional human rights and gender equality approach throughout our structure and our work. That's kind of positioned as a rainbow. And then you see a chart that shows how we move from supporting organizations of persons with disabilities to build movements, drive the agenda, and achieve rights so that persons with disabilities can fully participate in society and enjoy equal rights and opportunities. So to break this down a little bit, I want to start by talking about our approaches, and then we'll talk about the lenses to our work. So we use three approaches to drive all of our work. And those approaches are grant making, that's flexible and responsive. We use technical assistance to build back better, and then advocacy so nobody's left behind. And I want to zoom into the grant making because I think how we do grant making is super important. And again, this is one of those things we could do a whole other session on, but I'm just going to give the top line now. We use a participatory grant making ethos, which basically means that the persons with disabilities, and in particular activists with disabilities from around the world, are a large part of our grant making committee. So they sit with some of our donors to make funding decisions. It is not our board that makes funding decisions. It is not our staff that makes funding decisions. Everything in the pooled fund is done by this grant making committee. And so, as Diana is going to talk about in a little bit, that's all kind of born out of this disability rights movement mantra, nothing about us without us. And I'll leave it to her piece to go a little bit more into that. But the idea is like, you can't make decisions about us without us sitting at the decision-making table. So that was built into the structure of our fund from the very beginning. I'm just looking at my notes, sorry. One thing I glossed over is that we partner with organizations of persons with disabilities, specifically in the Global South. This is a really important decision, I think, because a lot of the places that we work are really under-resourced, and in a lot of cases, we are the only funder of a lot of these organizations. This is really important when you think about the lenses that undergird our work. So we have a gender equality lens, we have an intersectionality lens, and we have a participation lens, which you just heard a bit about. But I think what's really important to lift up here is that we're always looking for organizations of persons with disabilities in the Global South who are even more marginalized within the movement. So basically, like in other parts of society, the disability rights movement has its hierarchies. So you will often see on global stages, or at least prior to our work, men from urban areas who are educated with physical disabilities. They're sort of at the top of the hierarchy. And then we have, as you might be able to imagine, like Women are kind of below that. Persons with psychosocial disabilities are below that. Persons with albinism, for example, are below that. And so we really try to support and lift up those groups that are marginalized within the movement. And again, that intersectionality lens, the gender equality lens, and the participation lens really allow us to focus resources on doing that. Let me see. I actually think that those are the main points I wanted to cover. The rest you can kind of see on the slide here, but we're really just looking to build a more inclusive movement. And I think what's important too is just like the advocacy that we've seen. I don't want to take away from anything Melanie's going to share, but the advocacy that we've seen, especially in the past year during the pandemic, is just emblematic of like how much this model works. Organizations of persons with disabilities are like not just capable, but the best positioned to advocate for rights, and to do so in a way that's like strengthening not just this movement, but all of the intersecting movements, like the women's rights movement and Indigenous persons movement. So with that, I am going to go to the next slide and turn it over to Diana, who will fill in anything important that I glossed over and tell you more about Disability Rights 101.
Thank you so much, Jen. I think you did a great job. I would just like to add in so that people understand the scope of our work. Since our launch in 2008, we have given out over $38 million in 100 to 125 grants every year to organizations of persons with disabilities in the Global South. Our approach, as Jen was describing, is rights-based. And on this slide, there is a photo of the first 7 Indigenous leaders with disabilities, all grantees of ours, from Peru, Bangladesh, Mexico, Fiji, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea, who attended the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2012. They're standing in front of the globe at the UN headquarters in New York. And there's also, as Jen was saying, the Global Disability Community slogan here, "Nothing about us without us." The idea to establish the Disability Rights Fund came up during the process of the adoption of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the process of adopting that human rights treaty at the UN was very unique. It was actually very participatory. It was the first time that fully 1/3 of the seats of the working group that drafted the treaty text were reserved for civil society. And civil society, in this case, meaning activists with a diversity of disabilities from around the world. The CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, was adopted in 2006 and entered into force in 2008. And it, for the first time in history, so we're talking about 2006, for the first time in history, explicitly recognized that persons with disabilities are rights holders covered by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and other human rights treaties in the same way as anyone else. And this mattered not only because this is the 21st century, just a reminder, and we should be recognizing each other for the beautiful, diverse, equal human beings we are, and not only because human rights are indivisible and universal, and because everyone should live a life of dignity, but it mattered because of the scope of the population of persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide lists a number of data points about persons with disabilities. And even though I bet each and every one of you knows someone with a disability, whether that's a physical disability, a sensory impairment like blindness or deafness, an intellectual disability like Down syndrome or a learning disability, a psychosocial disability, mental illness, whether that disability is visible or invisible, And even though we all hope to age and along the way probably acquire some disabilities, I'm glasses as an example here, in general, too many people are not aware of data about disability. Of the more than 7 billion, almost 8 billion now, humans on the planet, 1 billion people are people with disabilities. That's 1 in every 7 people. Because of the close linkages between disability and poverty, there's a higher prevalence of disability among populations who are poorer. That means women, it means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In fact, 1 in every 5 women is a woman with disability. So we're talking about 20% of the female population. Up until the CRPD was adopted, remember, 2006, persons with disabilities were not seen as full rights holders. And they were treated, including by donors and the philanthropic sector, as objects for charity, services, medical interventions, or passive recipients, not active participants in their own lives. The Disability Rights Fund has been turning this power dynamic on its head. And we've been doing it because we are a participatory grant maker, as Jen was describing. Persons with disabilities have been and are key decision makers in what we do. And how? Our board in our bylaws has a commitment to 50% or more of its members being persons with disabilities. Our grant making committee, which supports strategy at country level and makes decisions on grants, basically decides where our money goes, is majority persons with disabilities. And the majority of our staff come from the disability movement. So this structure is not only the right and the just thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Who knows better about how to make grant making accessible to a variety of people with different disabilities than persons with disabilities? Who knows the priorities of the movement and what supports are needed better than persons with disabilities? So the structure and process of our work gives agency to people who benefit from our funding, people with lived experience, and they determine the priorities of their own lives. Over the last year and right now, as we all are facing the pandemic and ongoing and increasing inequality as a global community, the idea that it is okay to value some people over others because of age or health status or class or disability or race is overwhelmingly present. Our grantees, organizations of persons with disabilities, have faced situations made worse by COVID where persons with disabilities are forgotten or devalued. My colleague Melanie, who's going to speak next, will talk about how our grantees have been addressing these situations and what we've been learning during this crisis. Thank you all for being here. Melanie.
Thanks, Diana. And on this next slide, there's a cover picture of a report that DRF was one of the coordinating group members of, just on the context of persons with disabilities. So a global survey was sent out, 2,100 responses were collected from 135 different countries around the world, really monitoring the human rights status of persons with disabilities in the midst of COVID. We'll share the link a little later, and I will reference some of the information to give an understanding of how persons with disabilities were disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic. I'll also be sharing with you just a brief overview of what our monitoring, evaluation, and learning looks like at DRF, DRAF. The second piece I'll be sharing is what our COVID response looked like, as well as our achievements that we've seen over the past year. And as Diana and Jen have alluded to, then some of the lessons learned that have come out of 1 year, sort of at least into this pandemic. So on our first slide that you see here, I have 4 principles of our monitoring and evaluation, as well as 3 tools we use for our M&E. I'll spend some time today talking about our principles and the tools that we work, because it's important that all of our systems reflect the participatory principles that Diana and Jen have been talking about. And we're actually in the middle of a research project funded by the Ford Foundation about the influence of our participatory grant-making model on the effectiveness and responsiveness that has been captured over multiple years across many external evaluations that we've commissioned. But I'll first talk about some of our four main principles. Jen talked about us being rights-based and principles-based, and that's true for how we learn internally as well. So our first piece is that we're committed to a rights-based approach, as you can tell already from Jen and Diana's presentations. And this approach reflects the principles on the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to think about accountability, participation, empowerment, and non-discrimination, as well as the movement's motto, which Jen talked about, nothing about us without us. So to give an example of how we have our grantees participate in our monitoring and evaluation, to show that we value their perspectives, not only in data collection and analysis, but also in determining what kind of change matters. So as grant makers, as donors, we often are in the position of power where we get to decide what's measured and we get to decide what success looks like. But we wanted to shift this even further. So in one of our two most recent evaluations, that Diana just put the link up to, you can see sort of the most recent evaluations. One of them that focused on our grant making in the Pacific Island countries, we asked our grantees to decide the focus of that evaluation. That happened during an evaluation design workshop that took place during an annual meeting of the Pacific Disability Forum. And in return for them helping us to design and decide what our evaluation looked like, then per the grantee's request, they were given some M&E training, some technical training around the different terminology and language and things that would help them both improve their own advocacy and get support from other donors. So the second principle is a commitment to long-term capacity development of the disability movement through our M&E. And like the previous example demonstrated, we seek to build the capacity of a diverse movement of persons with disabilities and to build strong foundations for sustainable future. So we may provide M&E training so that they can go on to get more funding from other funders as well as in addition from us. And we recognize that this takes time, right? Particularly when you're working with a marginalized group like persons with disabilities who may have even been excluded to access from elementary school, for example, let alone full participation in society. The third principle that drives our monitoring and evaluation is inclusiveness and recognition of the diversity of the disability movement. So as you may have picked up, and as we've mentioned here a bit more, that the disability community is not a one-size-fits-all. Marginalization and inequality, as Jen pointed out, exists among disability groups based on characteristics that she's already covered. And so a key objective for us is to promote inclusion and equity and diversity as reflected within the principles of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And our monitoring and evaluation captures this. One example is that we use a logical framework for those that are familiar with M&E terminology to measure our work. And we added an indicator for the first time. It was just revised, our log frame was just revised this year. And the indicator was asking grantees to tell us whether or not they thought the movement had become more inclusive of these marginalized groups. And so we weren't just counting, for instance, we count things like numbers of grants given out or the numbers of national or local legislation passed or the number of grants given to women with disabilities, but we wanted to also know what grantees thought about how their inclusion is growing over the years. And the fourth and final principle for us is that our evaluation and our learning is a mutual benefit to the organization and our staff and to the grantees and the broader disability movement. as Diana has alluded, this is a relatively new movement in the sense there are some grantees that have been working for their rights for their entire lifetime, so for over 3 decades, for example, and yet funding mechanisms and space for disability rights and a focus on it in philanthropy is relatively new. So there isn't a lot of lessons learned. There's not a lot of scholarship out there about what works for persons with disabilities to be self-advocates. And so we're trying to contribute to that body of knowledge so that other persons with disabilities and other funders understand how do they also contribute to this effective and growing movement. So one of the examples of how we do this is, I had mentioned that we've just done evaluations recently. So we took those lessons learned, right? That our evaluators really write for us as the audience and write for our donors, and then reframed it so that our grantees and other organizations of persons with disabilities could use that information to improve their advocacy projects, to improve their activities, as well as to get, as I said previously, more funders in other spaces. So a couple of tools and methods that we use internally is something that we call learning journals. This is based off of action research, where our program officers themselves are the ones reflecting on what has happened and what change has been achieved. I'm happy to get more technical about this, but also realize that this might be something that's very specific to people's interests. So I'll just briefly move over this. We also look at most significant change methods to help us think about how did this change happen, what was particularly important. We do this through individual and collective reflection discussions. Then we do a stakeholder feedback process every year. It's happened every year since 2011. And this past year, we call it our annual grantee survey, is that we've had the highest response rate since 2011 with 80%. So next slide, I want to share just 4 points on how we've responded to the pandemic. So this past year, more than any other year, we've been able to provide for flexible grants and funding so that organizations of persons with disabilities could actually be sustained through the pandemic. And this was possible in part because of our donors, also including bilateral donors that can have very specific funding requirements. They were flexible with us. And this was necessary because when COVID hit, our program team went back to each grantee to discuss possible changes to their grant activities. And a number of grantees at first said that no changes were necessary, but soon it became clear, as we had mentioned earlier, that persons with disabilities were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And I can go into that a little bit more later if people want specific examples of what that has looked like. But again, there's a lot of information in the COVID DRM, and there are actually a number of statements that we put out highlighting food insecurity, police brutality, in particular around persons with disabilities in the midst of COVID. So we'll post that up as opposed to going into that for now, for the sake of time. And grantees were always also able to increase their use of online communication as they switched up their activities. So through the annual grantee survey and through our program officer reflection processes, we've heard that the COVID context really provided new opportunities for grantees to do advocacy, new online venues, the ability to participate in international forum and invitations to, or openings in government discussions to talk about disability inclusive COVID responses. Next slide. And so on this slide, it's titled Results to Celebrate. I'm just going to briefly go over what sort of change have we seen in the last 12 months. So significant progress was actually made in the last year around the work that grantees were doing this. And some of the most rapid progress that we've actually ever seen in the fund's history have come about in the last year. So grantees advocated for disability inclusive COVID-19 communication. So for example, we've got captioning provided here But many of the national press conferences, you might even want to take US press conferences as an example on COVID, maybe even a year ago, did not include sign language interpreters. And so someone with a hearing impairment didn't know what COVID was, how do you get COVID, how do you protect yourself, what was the government mandating you do. Information about lockdowns was inaccessible, and that made persons with disabilities more vulnerable, both to getting COVID, and then in countries where security forces are more aggressive, then it made them more susceptible to run-ins with the police, hence the police brutality piece of that. I can go into that again later as well, if that's of interest to folks. But what we've seen was that in 9 different countries, disability inclusive COVID-19 responses began. So that includes in Fiji, Haiti, Indonesia, Malawi, Myanmar, Nigeria, Rwanda, Samoa, and the Solomon Islands. And this again is funded through grants that DRF and DRAF has provided, as well as maybe at the local level. So at the state or city level, there were more disability inclusive responses and government programs, and those happened in Malawi and Indonesia. And you can learn more about specific efforts that grantees have done through a COVID-19 page that we had set up. And you can, I think Dan is probably going to provide the link for that as well. And to give you just some comparison, so what does it mean that there were 9 achievements in the last year? So we haven't seen 9 government programs secured with grantee advocacy since 2016. And in some of these countries, actually Nigeria, for example, they just passed a National Disability Act within the last couple of years, and that was sitting on the various presidents' desks for 10 years. And some of these other countries, they don't have a National Disability Act yet. So Haiti is looking to update their National Disability Act to be compliant with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Solomon Islands is still advocating for National Disability Act. So they've been able to see an impressive amount of success in a relatively short period of time. Next slide. And what I have on this slide are 2 points that I wanted to share with you that we've learned. Being able to see more context, sort of political and economic context for persons with disabilities across the board. And so we were able to do some really interesting comparisons we haven't been able to do before because our target countries are so varied. That grantees were able to achieve the success and have more inclusive COVID-19 communications and programs, in large part due to the fact that there was existing advocacy skills and knowledge, as well as relationships with government officials. So grantees had already established themselves as subject matter experts for disability inclusion prior to the COVID crisis. And so when the COVID crisis hit, they were the ones that were invited to task force to talk about what could be done to make things more disability inclusive. And so this is like a perfect disaster preparedness principle that got played out in real time that we were able to see. The second piece, as I had mentioned earlier, is that the pandemic provided new ways for grantees to do advocacy, and we can talk about that later if that's interesting for folks. But really, it also provided a framework in which to backdrop the consequence of years of neglect by governments of the rights of persons with disabilities and the lack of inclusion of persons with disabilities. And so I will just stop there. I'm happy to answer more questions in the Q&A, but I know we want to leave as much time as possible. So I'll pass it over back to Mia.